there's an implication here with a lot of the tools we've been talking about that they do in fact build trust. But we have almost no idea whether that's actually true. And I'm wondering if you guys have thoughts on this notoriously tough nut to crack, of really understanding how technology is or is not increasing engagement and trust and participation. How do we measure that, and how do we know if we're actually moving the needle? So for example, in Boston with Discover BPS, we've heard from the school board that it has changed the relationship between the school administration and the parents. But the word change implies that there's some delta that you can measure. And we have no idea where the parents were really before the introduction of a tool like BPS, Discover BPS, and where they are now, and whether that has ripple effects into their other interactions with government. So I'm wondering if you guys can comment on how we get more concrete about the impact that these tools are making.
I'm going to chime in first here. Trust is hard, right? I think trust is so tied to an experience. And I think trust is a manifestation of a good experience in large regard, right? So you think about trust in consumer brands, it's not because they trust a phone more or less than they trust another phone. Oftentimes because they trust the experience, the company that produces that particular phone. And I think the DMV and the Apple Store is a really interesting example in that there's an inherent trust built in the culture of that. Now, to the point of measurement, I think that reflects itself in awareness, the number of people that are involved. I'm not a huge advocate of using big, bold numbers around engagement because I think they can be a little bit self-serving. But it's a really hard question. I think, trust is something you feel, you know it when you see it, and the delta or the actual tangible number, I think, is something that as an industry we have to think about how we do measure that around consistent metrics.
Yeah, I actually would definitely second that. I mean, I think the idea of like where does technology fit into that engagement process? I think what we've been learning, even in the Caribbean and even in the case of with the work of the fellows, is that technology is really a powerful enabler. And it's when you place it in that social context, you can improve and kind of drastically change that user experience between the government and the citizen. And if you think about what that engagement means, in the case of the iPhone example, if you have a farmer that has registered to enter into become an officially registered farmer, and it takes the registration process takes anywhere from 2 months to 2 years before they get that farmer ID back, then that is a terrible user experience. And you're not surprised then when a farmer says, well, I don't want to participate in anymore and engage with the government because the entry point for that interaction was so poor. And so you can build technology and leverage technology to make that interaction a much better place and then ultimately build on kind of that engagement process. But I think the process, the research and kind of understanding where those touch points are really valuable to understand the question.
Well, that highlights another challenge in that if you build engagement platforms that that allow citizens to feed into the system but don't actually provide them any sense that their feedback meant anything or they don't get the card for 2 years, we're actually doing more harm than good in many ways. So than if we had never asked in the first place. And Nick, you have built a platform that is pretty unique in the world of citizen engagement platforms, and there are many of them, that actually works because there's a mechanism there for governments to do something with the feedback that is coming from citizens. And we saw it yesterday when Shannon from San Francisco talked about the way that she's using her platform on the Improve SF site. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about the process behind building a tool that actually provided a full feedback loop, not just a one-way feedback loop?
It was interesting. We made a conscious decision. We came from working with governments in a more traditional consulting route. So we saw how important the feedback component and how slow it was for the most part. And so we made a decision at the beginning that we wouldn't just stand up a site in a city, right? That we actually had to have a formal partner in the form of the city because their commitment of time and dollars was so important, the affirmation component. And one of the turning points, I think, for Nathan and I early on was you look at things like UPS that gives you a tracking code for your package, and even Domino's Pizza, for God's sake, that shows you when your pizza is going to be delivered. Right? Those are feedback loops that then create affirmation, which you re-engage with. And We've been very intentional about trying to build into the product the feedback, the formal and informal feedback loops, but I actually think the flip side of that is it requires work. And a lot of entities don't realize that they actually have to have someone that's willing to re-engage. Like the feedback just doesn't take care of itself because you have something in the product. And so there's a cultural element to it inside of a city that says we're committed to the same kind of effort that we do in offline, which is hours and hours of meeting preparation and meetings itself. We're going to put that same level of effort in the online, knowing that the reach of the online is at a different velocity than the offline component.
I think just a quick point on the metrics concept. There are existing systems like Google Analytics to determine how popular a piece of software is. I mean, any startup is sitting, hitting refresh on Google Analytics to see your refers and your visits. So I think actually more transparency on that front, like a show your stats movement. I'd love to see a show your stats movement in our industry, where it's nice to have some buzz when you launch something, but actually say, yeah, actually nobody actually looks at this.
On that note, though, I think standardization of those stats is really fundamental, and I don't think this industry has done that yet, right? So social networks are really standardized. They have weekly active use and daily active use and monthly active use, and the venture capital industry has kind of got behind that, and the companies now measure each other fairly around similar stats. And I don't think engagement has come to a place where we've said that either participants or visits or ideas or comments or whatever it is an industry standard for this, so that you can actually, you have an apples to apples ROI kind of discussion.
But maybe the reason is because none of those things really get at trust or engagement in a way that's like, okay, I got up from my computer and I felt like I was a more full participant in this system, right? So like comments or views or the stuff that Google Analytics is going to tell you doesn't really get at the feeling of citizenship, that now I can go and feel like there's some efficacy involved. Like I can get up and do something and my voice matters, and I can build something that's going to be useful.
Well, that's the flip side of what we're just talking about in terms of the feedback loop. That can be challenging because you may have used technology to speak. The government may have heard what you said and then have decided that it's a demonstrably terrible idea.
But they should tell you. That's
exactly,
a great idea.
But when we talk about trust, actually, it's both ways too. To say, okay, cool, you did listen to me. It's a terrible idea. I understand why. And I think that, especially the 11% who are deeply engaged and go to these meetings, that might be a difficult concept often.
I mean, I'm assuming there are a lot of city employees here who the idea of just opening the fire hose of citizen ideas is not just terrifying, but like, how are we supposed to manage? We're cutting staff. We don't have budgets. Where are we supposed to find the people and the processes that can actually do something useful with this information? And Nick, your platform is one of those ways, not to plug it too hard. But what do you say to city employees who say, I can't give people this input because I can't do anything with it?
I actually think in many ways, right, using technology is an advantage to what you mentioned, which is cutting budgets and cutting staffs, because the cost of it, you have to engage, right? Our cities are doing some form of engagement, either explicitly in the form of meetings or technology, or implicitly in the form of people coming to a planning counter. And the reach using technology with the level of effort that is not commensurate to what it takes to do a meeting, the technology enables some of that to happen in a way that can be, in many ways pointed to as more efficient and more effective. And I want to go back real quick. I would argue a little bit that the number of people involved isn't a useful metric. I think trust is a very core metric, but getting people involved that traditionally have not been involved in the discussion, in an ideation process or a survey process or an interactive budgeting process, I still think is important, because you can't get trust until you get them involved. So some of those are vanity metrics, but some of those metrics are important because of the 11% of people that only show up to meetings, right? So if you can improve that, there are ways to get at the segmentation, the deeper level of that and understanding. But that core metric is still fundamental for a lot of cities, at least at this stage of where we are in the iteration of this process.
So I want to get up to that. The people who haven't been involved traditionally, and Matthew, you laid out some pretty stark numbers, how do you even try to talk about citizen participation in a context where the federal government in Jamaica, let alone the citizens, are kind of working with 2 hands, 3 hands tied behind their back when half the annual budget goes to debt servicing?
Yeah, I think actually and David made a comment earlier this morning in his remarks about the idea that the space that, the civic tech space, that there are lots of interesting parallels of other people doing this type of work in other spaces. So when you think about, say, the ICT 4D or the development space, the idea of service delivery indicators are very normal practices. And so when you talk about, you look at hospitals or kind of maternal health, and you think about, well, what does birth registrations look like in a particular community or across a number of communities, and measuring, what do the birth registration numbers look like? Have mothers followed up and come back for second checkups and those types of things, and then looking at the kind of the impact analysis around that. There are a lot of interesting insights there about how do we measure engagement with citizens. And so when we're thinking about those metrics, and not necessarily just how long are people staying there, but how are people voting with their actions? And does the fact that someone comes to a hospital today for their first checkup, maybe for the second checkup, and never comes back again afterwards, how are we thinking about that in, I guess, kind of in traditional sense, that case, and just the ways that engagement falls off the barrier? How are we thinking about that within the context of service delivery? And so I do think that there are lots of interesting parallels maybe in the development space or in other areas where people have been thinking about those things that we can then now port back to thinking about engagement in cities as well.
And Dan, you're working in a city that has some deep and entrenched historical issues of inequality and oppression, and trying to get at that and really empower the people who for decades have not been empowered through technology is hard. And I'm wondering if you have lessons about really activating those people who have been left out of the process.
Again, I think that the main thing to do, you can't do anything unless you try. So creating systems, actual processes that engage people where they live, in the way they choose to be engaged, in the way that they're able to be engaged because of device limitations, connectivity, wherever they're able to connect to these interfaces that we all make between them and government. So it's really just step-by-step work to do flyering and go to libraries, and we hired an email marketing firm that typically does work on clubs, and in underserved neighborhoods that are really quite fun. And then we sent them emails about getting a $5 Visa gift card for testing, and it was amazing. We got hundreds of signups just from that list of 5,000 people. So there's just really simple methods that everybody uses to try to engage people, and it's just developing a system to do it and do it.
Just asking as a start.
Yeah.
We've got about 90 seconds left. I'm wondering if you guys can just say quickly whether you think it's even possible to come back to a place where that township ethos that I described from the early 18th century America, can we get to a place where we've totally collapsed the boundaries between government and citizens? Do we want to get to that place?
Yeah, I think representative democracy works too well in a lot of places.
Not here.
Yeah, but that we put so much stake in the one individual that represents a rather large district that we've kind of become complacent. I think the technology is enabling it. I think work on the ground is enabling that. I think a generation that has come up with a pride in their cities and a pride in their places enables that. So I think it's closer. I think it has to be tied to actual things, right? So we talked about co-authorship of legislation. Those are really formal, fundamental changes where I can see formal feedback loops. And I think when the continuum stretches across that, from implicit to formal, I think you've got a really good shot at breaking some of those barriers down.
I think it is possible to come back to that township ethos. I think that we have to accept and work with the fact that it's going to be far more chaotic and goofy than a township infrastructure. and that already exists in hundreds and thousands of websites where people can talk, and it's just, yeah, it's pretty chaotic.
I think what's exciting is how, I think the short answer to your question is yes, but I also think it's exciting how that township idea and that engagement idea changes in different contexts, whether it is engagement around, predial larceny or participatory budgeting in Brazil, or people trying to define like how they want to create their own, smallholder farmer engagement groups. I think the ways in which those engagement models collapse government and citizen, but also citizen to citizen engagement, are also really exciting to look at too.
Well, there's clearly a lot of work still to be done here. One of the takeaways for me is that we really need to get at what these metrics are that can be standard. And maybe that's a session that some of you may want to propose for tomorrow, that we can discuss more and put it on our civic to-do list. So thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.